What we know as the fight or flight response, that encounter with something terrifying, which makes us either fight or flight, was first described in 1932. But actually, it's something which probably is embedded in so many cultural artifacts of human history. And one in particular, where we can see that dynamic at work, is the Ten Commandments. The people, as we read about on Shavuot, only actually hear those first 10 statements, what we call in Hebrew the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances. That's all that they directly hear. That's why they're so important. But yet, of course, there's so much more to the Torah. There's 613 mitzvot that eventually are recorded in the Torah, and there's all the events that happen after. But the revelation, the content that's given to Moses, the people aren't there. They don't hear it. And the reason is because as we read, if we look carefully at the story of the Ten Commandments in Exodus, the reason is because the people run away. Now, they have good reason to be afraid. And when it tells us in verse 16 of chapter 20 that the people were so terrified of the noise and the thunder and the catastrophic appearance of the mountain, of smoke and lightning and of sounds that they couldn't describe, that's not surprising that they would be afraid. It tells us they were afraid. It tells us they trembled. And they were warned before about all the dangers of this encounter. Chapter 19 of Exodus is all about this setup for the Ten Commandments, all about what's going to happen. Moses runs interference going back and forth between them and God, explaining the deal. It's all a prearranged agreement. God will give them this revelation, will expose to them this divine truth, and in exchange, they have to sit and listen. They have to behold the terrifying sight of the mountain on fire, and they have to listen to the commandments and to the revelation that God is going to offer them. They agree to do so. There's certain restrictions. There's a perimeter set up. Anyone who crosses it will be killed. There's clearly a danger of going near the mountain. The mountain is itself some kind of radioactive or contagious entity. The people are understandably quite scared about what's going to happen. And yet, when God begins to speak, contained in whatever way we imagine within that mountaintop, the people are there and present for those first 10 utterances. But there's no number 11, because after the first 10, they turn tail and run. There's something really profound about this idea, and in particular, Shavuot gives us the opportunity to really connect with it. Because Shavuot is meant to be a reenactment, in some way, of that moment, when our ancestors stood at the foot of Mount Sinai and listened to God and saw the sounds and experienced the majesty and power of that moment. But we also don't want to replicate everything they do. In particular, we don't want to replicate that flight response that sees them run away. Because what happens, of course, is they say, Moses, we'll just let you do the rest. They run away, they flee, they return to the camp, and they leave Moses to be their intermediary. It says literally in verse 15, all the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the blare of the horn and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. You speak to us, they said to Moses, and we'll obey. But please don't let God speak to us, because we might die. Strange in some way for us who obviously see this encounter with God as so central to our own ethos, to see the people so afraid. It makes sense. It must have been a scary moment to be in. But we'd want them to be better. We'd want them to rise to that challenge, to be there, to witness, and to respond to this incredible experience. And yet they fall victim to something which many of us can relate to all the time. It might be that we see in this our fight or flight response, but it might be more mundane as well. It might just simply be those moments in our life when we fail to rise to the challenges in front of us. In particular, we often do this when there's big things in our life which we're scared to actually encounter in a real and honest way. For some of us, it might be a career change, an instance where we don't actually have the courage to deal with the possible rejection of taking on something new. It can be really scary not knowing what will happen, and often we're put off by that fear, to the extent that we don't take chances. More often, it's love. There's so many instances where people aren't able to really commit themselves to be in love, because being in love requires exposing yourself, making yourself vulnerable, acknowledging the danger of the brokenheartedness that could come out of it. But without that vulnerability, you can't ever have that encounter. If you just run away, you won't be able to hear the revelation. And that's where this image is so powerful, because what God is offering them is truth and faith, something which is a metaphysical encounter with the beyond, something which presumably we all in some way desire. But when it's actually in front of them, they're too afraid to actually stand there and to listen and to behold and to stand their ground. After all, it's always easier to have someone else do it. Have someone else report back on what God said. That way, we can continue to keep those walls up, to shield ourselves, to protect our inner vulnerable selves. But if we do that, we sacrifice the opportunity for transcendence. That's what's at stake. Whether in work or love or in faith, if we want transcendence, we have to find a way to stand strong at the foot of that metaphorical mountain. We can't just run away when things become powerful and leave someone else to be the middleman. We have to bring ourselves to that mountain and stand there and hear the voice which emerges from that thunder and lightning. Just before we read about the Israelites turning tail and running, we read that they saw the sounds. This language is, of course, really strange. Most of us don't see sound, we hear it. Perhaps it's evocative of synesthesia, the experience of being able to cross-process sensory input. But more likely, it's a way to try and capture that overwhelming potency of the perception of God at that moment. That moment was so intense that audio and visual got mixed up, and that scared them more than anything. Not being certain of their own perceptions, it seems, is what really did them in. So the Israelites do a runner, and Moses is left holding the bag. Yet on Shavuot, we return to that moment just before, when everyone stood as equals at the foot of the mountain, experiencing the mighty majesty of God's revelation. For the length of those 10 short utterances, the people listened directly to God. It's that moment we try to recapture on Shavuot, the opportunity to have a do-over, to encounter God directly. It presents it to us every day. We have that chance in every moment to encounter God directly. But especially on Shavuot, we have the chance to do better than our ancestors. We have the chance to engage and to connect and to explore the encounter with the divine without running away, without letting our fear overtake us, and without allowing ourselves to think, even for a moment, that someone else could possibly do it in our stead. We have to, and we have to right now. Chag Same'ach.